Gareth had loved Anna since he was 5 years old. He remembered that day as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. Back then, he was sitting by a muddy puddle, covered head to toe in dirt, shaping crude little figures out of wet earth. His hands were buried in the sticky muck, and in that small, messy world, he was completely happy. Then she appeared, Anna. She approached so suddenly that Gareth froze, afraid to make a single move. She wore a clean, almost festive dress, and her dark hair was neatly braided. She didn't say a word, just stood there, tilting her head to one side, watching him. Then, to his astonishment, she leapt straight into the mud. No hesitation, no fear of getting dirty or being scolded by her parents. She laughed, a sound so pure and bright that it seemed to echo through the world, while mud flew everywhere like a celebratory firework. In that moment, Gareth knew. This was his person. From then on, they were inseparable. Now, both 16, they were planning to marry soon, if everything went as it should. Gareth dreamed of their wedding day just as much as Anna did. He imagined her walking down the aisle in a white dress, the village priest blessing their union under the soft glow of sunlight. But it was Anna who lived for this dream. She could spend hours talking about her wedding dress, about the wreath of wildflowers she wanted woven into her hair. But fate had other plans. Anna was taken. Along with her, several other girls from the village vanished. For Gareth, it was as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. Despair mingled with fury, and he swore to himself he would find her no matter the cost. He began to investigate, but there were agonizingly few clues. Still, one day in a nearby village, he overheard a snippet of conversation. Someone had seen strange people. They kept their faces hidden under hoods, their eyes glinting like those of wild animals. Gareth knew immediately. This was the lead he'd been searching for. He tracked them for weeks, through forests, across fields, along barely visible trails. Eventually, in the depths of the woods, he spotted one of them. The figure moved quickly, glancing over his shoulder as if fearing he was being followed. Gareth was careful. He melted into the shadows of the trees and trailed the man silently. The trail led to a strange clearing. In its center stood a massive stone obelisk, covered in enigmatic runes and carvings. Around it bustled figures in robes, their movements sharp and purposeful. They were preparing for something terrible. Gareth dropped to the ground, pressing himself into the dirt to stay hidden. His eyes scanned frantically for Anna. And then he saw her. She was bound to one of 12 stone pillars, arranged in a circle like the hours on a clock. Each of the pillars was taller than a man. The girls tied to these stones were in varying states, some unconscious, others quietly weeping, while a few simply stared ahead as though resigned to their fate. Anna was in the center. Her eyes were open, but the light that once danced in them was gone. Gareth's heart pounded so loudly he thought they might hear it. He wanted to rush out, to cut her free, to destroy every one of those people. But he knew that would be his last act. He forced himself to retreat deeper into the bushes, slowing his breath as much as he could. He needed to wait, to bide his time. Noon was approaching, and the tension in the clearing grew thicker with every passing moment. The robed figures buzzed around the obelisk like bees at a hive, their movements feverish and precise. Gareth lay hidden, his breathing shallow as he watched them disappear one by one into a large black tent that loomed ominously nearby. His heart pounded, a drumbeat of desperation, but his mind screamed a single thought: now or never. Scanning the clearing quickly, Gareth ensured the coast was clear. Then, crouching low, he bolted toward Anna. She noticed him as he reached her, and tears spilled from her eyes, streaking her dirt-smudged face. Gareth pressed a finger to his lips, silently begging her to stay quiet, as he began fumbling with the ropes that bit cruelly into her wrists. Anna trembled, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs, as fragile as a cornered animal. But their whispered exchange had not gone unnoticed. The other girls, bound to the surrounding stones, began pleading with Gareth in hushed, desperate voices. Their words tumbled over one another, thick with despair. He couldn't meet their eyes. His focus was on Anna, but their quiet cries tore at his resolve. "Please," he muttered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Please, for the love of God, be quiet." Then, one of the girls tied nearby began muttering something unintelligible. Her voice was strange, wavering, like someone speaking in their sleep. Gareth turned his head, and the sight chilled him to his core. Her eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, as though trying to focus on something unseen. And then she let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound was raw, primal, and it shattered the stillness of the clearing like breaking glass. Gareth's stomach twisted with dread. The scream had done it, alerted them. The robed figures poured out of the black tent like a swarm of locusts, encircling him in seconds. He grabbed Anna's hand, desperation fueling his every move. But before he could pull her free, a heavy blow struck the back of his head, and the world dissolved into darkness. When Gareth came to, pain pulsed through his skull. His arms were stretched above his head, bound tightly to the trunk of a tree. Dazed, he blinked, trying to take in his surroundings. The clearing had transformed. The robed figures now stood in a perfect circle around the obelisk. There were 12 of them, each clutching a small glass vial filled with a thick crimson liquid. They moved in unison, their voices rising and falling in a guttural chant, spoken in a language Gareth didn't recognize but instinctively feared. He turned his head toward the obelisk, and his blood ran cold. Its shadow stretched long across the clearing, creeping closer to Anna, who was still bound to her stone. The moment the shadow's tip reached her, the world seemed to hold its breath. Noon had come. The chanting ceased abruptly. The robed figures moved as one, approaching each of the girls. One by one, they forced the vial's contents down the girls' throats. Gareth thrashed against his bindings, screaming hoarsely, but his cries were drowned out by the ritual's ominous silence. He watched helplessly as Anna swallowed the thick red liquid. Almost immediately, thin crimson lines began to spiderweb across her pale skin, as if her very veins were cracking open. Her eyes turned a sickening shade of red, and she began to scream, a sound of pure, unfiltered agony. The other girls soon followed, their bodies writhing in torment as their screams joined Anna's. Their limbs contorted unnaturally, as though something inside them was tearing them apart. Gareth's vision blurred with tears, his throat raw from shouting. He could only watch, powerless, as the light and life drained from the girl he had loved his entire life. The robed figures resumed their chanting, their voices rising in a unified, hypnotic drone. Then, from the black tent, another figure emerged. This one was different, larger, more menacing. He was bald, his skin covered in pulsating red tattoos that seemed to writhe as if alive. His face was locked in a cruel, predatory grin, and in his hands he held a glowing red stone, fiery and alive with malevolent energy. The figure moved with deliberate slowness, like a predator toying with its prey. He approached the obelisk, inserting the stone into a carved recess at its center. The moment the stone clicked into place, the obelisk erupted with crimson light, bathing the clearing in a ghastly, otherworldly glow. The chanting grew louder, almost deafening, as the robed figure began to circle the obelisk, his movements wild, his voice reaching an ecstatic crescendo. Then it began. Beams of light shot from the girls' bodies, streaking toward the obelisk like streams of liquid fire. Their life force, their very essence, was being siphoned away. Gareth screamed, his body shaking violently as he watched Anna, his Anna shrivel before his eyes, her flesh withered, collapsing inward until all that remained was a brittle, mummified shell. Her scream cut off abruptly, leaving only the droning chant of the robed figures. The obelisk now shone like a sun, its brilliance unbearable. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, a massive red beam burst from its peak, piercing the heavens. Gareth tilted his head upward, his breath catching in his throat. Above, the sky was splitting apart. Through the jagged cracks, something vast and incomprehensible stirred, a writhing, chaotic force that defied understanding. Gareth could only watch, frozen with terror, as the world unraveled around him. This was no longer just a nightmare. It was the end of everything. Night wrapped the city in a thick blanket of silence, broken only by distant, disjointed shouts echoing from somewhere far behind. Richard knew the search party was out there, hunting for the intruder, but he no longer cared. In his arms, Agna rested, her breathing finally steady and calm, a fragile rhythm that hinted at some fleeting sense of peace. Her face, worn thin by suffering, now seemed serene, as though she knew she was safe, for the moment at least. Richard moved through the dark alleyways, careful to tread lightly, always following the old man who led the way. The street lamps had long since gone out, and only the occasional beam of moonlight pierced through the rooftops, casting strange, shifting shadows. Trash piles lined the walls, and the air was thick with the stench of decay and dampness. Every so often, Richard glanced over his shoulder, clutching Agna tighter, as if she were the most precious thing left in his world. They rounded a corner, only to be met with a dead end. A solid brick wall loomed ahead, unyielding. Richard halted, his eyes darting nervously, his grip tightening around Agna. Had they taken a wrong turn? But before panic could take hold, the old man spoke in a low, steady voice. "This way." The old man seemed unfazed by the apparent barrier. He stepped forward, running his hands across the rough surface of the wall, his fingers moving with practiced precision. He tapped the bricks one by one, his movements quick and sure, until finally he stopped and pressed against one that stood out just slightly, a subtle shift in shade. The wall trembled. Richard felt the faint vibration underfoot as the bricks began to shift, grinding against one another, releasing a fine mist of dust. Slowly, a dark opening emerged, perfectly rectangular, like a door leading into the unknown. "Follow me," the old man said, stepping into the darkness without hesitation. Richard hesitated only a moment before following, holding Agna close to his chest. The passage was narrow, the air growing increasingly damp and oppressive with each step. The walls, made of worn brick, twisted and turned like a labyrinth, offering no sense of direction. They were cool to the touch, damp with moss, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with the metallic tang of rust. Somewhere in the distance, the steady drip of water echoed ominously. At last they stopped before a massive wooden door, blackened with age. The old man knocked, 2 short taps followed by 1 long one. Footsteps approached from the other side, and the door creaked open just enough to reveal a man's shadowy face. He glanced at the old man, then at Richard, saying nothing, before stepping aside to let them pass. The old man led them deeper into the space. The rooms were small, dimly lit by oil lamps that cast flickering light over the walls. The air here was thick with the scent of herbs and something sharp, almost medicinal. They reached a larger room with a bed at its center, and 2 women in long dresses approached. Richard hesitated, but finally allowed them to take Agna. They carried her gently away, promising to clean her wounds and care for her. Left alone by the door, Richard watched them go, an ache building in his chest. He didn't know how long he waited before the women returned, their expressions reassuring. "She's safe now," one of them said softly. Richard stepped into the room where Agna lay. She was curled up on the bed, her face peaceful at last, though faint traces of exhaustion lingered on her cheeks. He approached quietly, a rare, warm smile spreading across his face. He hadn't realized how much he had come to care for this girl until now. In this moment, all he wanted was to protect her. Leaning down, he gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, but before he could retreat, the door opened and Lance and Finn walked in. Richard straightened quickly, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and irritation. Lance's sharp gaze caught the moment, and he smirked. "Did we interrupt something?" Lance asked, his tone dripping with mischief as he glanced at Finn. "Should we come back later, pal?" "Wait," Richard said, clearing his throat and stepping toward them, masking his discomfort. "You're here to check on Agna. I'll leave you to it." The two men moved toward the bed. Lance knelt beside Agna, his expression softening slightly as he examined her. "She's been through hell, hasn't she?" "How is she holding up?" he asked without looking back. "She'll recover," Richard replied curtly. But Lance wasn't listening. He placed his fingers lightly on Agna's hand, his eyes closing in concentration. "Her magical energy is in chaos," Lance said after a moment. "Looks like they were dosing her with something, probably in her food. She'll need a couple of days to stabilize." At those words, a dark fury flickered across Richard's face. Finn, standing nearby, clenched his fists, his jaw tight. Lance glanced at them and gave a wry chuckle. "Don't worry. Tomorrow, we'll make them pay for what they did to our princess." Rising to his feet, Lance gestured toward the door. "The others are waiting for you. They want to see you." Richard cast one last look at the sleeping Agna before following Lance and Finn out of the room. The anger inside him simmered, barely contained. Tomorrow, they would make their move. Tomorrow, those responsible would pay dearly. Richard followed Lance and Finn down the narrow corridors, his irritation slowly giving way to confusion. The air grew heavier, the faint flicker of torches casting jagged shadows on the walls as they descended into a large chamber. At first glance, it seemed to be a meeting hall. In the center stood a massive round table, carved from dark wood polished to a reflective sheen. Around it sat a dozen figures. Their armor and clothing varied, but their expressions uniformly stern. The room buzzed with tense, hurried conversation, voices blending into a chaotic murmur. As Richard entered, the chatter abruptly ceased. One by one, the men and women rose from their seats, bowing their heads in unison. Richard froze in the doorway, baffled by the gesture. He nudged Finn with his elbow, whispering urgently, "Hey, what the hell's going on? Why are they bowing to me?" Finn smirked, his tone tinged with amusement. "You're the leader." "What?" Richard's voice edged toward incredulity, but Finn offered no further explanation. Before Richard could demand answers, one of the figures at the table stepped forward. This was no ordinary man. He wore gleaming armor etched with intricate designs of crescent moons and constellations, a celestial motif that shimmered faintly in the torchlight. His movements were poised, deliberate, and his face carried an air of authority. Silver hair, tied back in a short tail, framed his sharp, weathered features. Around his neck hung a heavy chain bearing the symbol of the order, a silver moon entwined with flowing ribbons. On his right hand glimmered an ornate gauntlet studded with gemstones, a mark of rank and power. "We've been waiting for you," the man said, his voice deep and resonant. He gestured toward a chair at the table, larger and more ornate than the others. Its high back was carved with detailed engravings, clearly marking it as a seat of command. Richard hesitated as the man approached, ushering him toward the chair. Reluctantly, he took his place, and the others followed suit, settling back into their seats. The man introduced himself. "I am Eldar, commander of the Knights of the Moonlit Order. I regret that I was away on a mission when tragedy struck. I failed to protect the lady." His voice faltered briefly, and he bowed his head in solemn regret. "But what's done is done," he continued, his tone steeling. "We are here now to set it right, to free her and restore the kingdom." Eldar gestured broadly to the assembly. At my summons, the best of our order have gathered. Richard's gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of those assembled. Each person radiated a distinct aura of competence or danger. He quickly realized these were not ordinary warriors. These were people who had seen death and didn't flinch. The first to draw his attention was a wiry man with sharp, angular features. His lean frame seemed as taut and deadly as the dagger he twirled effortlessly between his fingers. His narrow, predator-like eyes glinted with malice, and his thin lips curled into a smile that was anything but friendly. Richard felt an immediate sense of unease. "This is Sly," Eldar explained, following Richard's gaze. "Our master of espionage and silent kills." Sly inclined his head slightly, his dagger never ceasing its hypnotic spin. There was a threat in his smile, subtle but undeniable. Beside him sat a towering brute of a man. His massive shoulders strained against the leather armor he wore, stained with old blood and grime. His face was a map of scars, his eyes glinting with a feral intensity. He exuded raw, brutal power, like a caged beast waiting for an excuse to strike. His enormous hands rested on the table, each the size of a warhammer. Around his neck hung a necklace adorned with the tooth of some monstrous predator. "This is Dagnar," Eldar continued, "our enforcer. He is the strength of the Order." Dagnar let out a low grunt, but said nothing, his gaze heavy and unrelenting as it swept across the room. Further down sat a man who, at first glance, seemed laughably out of place. He was round and bloated, his corpulent frame spilling over the sides of his chair. Sweat gleamed on his forehead, and he occasionally dabbed at it with a stained kerchief. Yet his eyes were sharp, calculating, and his movements, though sluggish, were deliberate. He rubbed his hands together, the gesture oddly disconcerting. "Garvis," Eldar said, his tone almost amused, "a mage of considerable talent. Don't let appearances fool you. His mind is as formidable as his magic." Garvis grunted, offering a dismissive wave of his hand as if bored by the introduction. The others around the table remained silent, but their piercing gazes were fixed on Richard. Each of them carried an unmistakable aura of purpose and danger. These were no mere knights or adventurers. They were seasoned warriors, killers, and strategists, and they were waiting for him. Richard leaned back in his chair, mulling over what he'd just heard, then asked, "What's the situation?" Eldar, seated across from him, leaned slightly forward. His voice carried a confident edge, but each word trembled with a faint undertone of unease. "The lady and Balthazar are imprisoned in the palace dungeon. Tomorrow is the trial, but it's almost certain to end in an execution. We're debating whether to wait for the chaos the trial might bring or act now. However, our scouts report that the palace is guarded by forces from 3 factions: the Order of Light, the Mages of the Tower, and the Palace Guard. Breaking through would be near impossible. That's why I propose we strike during the trial." Before Eldar could finish, Dagnar, sitting to the left, shot to his feet. His massive fist slammed onto the table with a dull thud, sending a cloud of dust into the air. "Why wait?" he roared. "We act now. We storm in and crush those weaklings. The lady is waiting to be saved while you cowards sit here debating." "Don't be hasty," Eldar replied coldly. His gaze remained calm, but there was steel behind his words. "Underestimating the Order of Light would be a fatal mistake. Their mages are a real threat. The Palace Guard isn't made of fools either, and their battle mages will tear us apart if we charge in without a plan. On top of that, we still don't know the exact location of the lady or Balthazar. Charging in blindly would be suicide." Dagnar slammed the table again, grinding his teeth. "You're all cowards," he growled, but before he could say more, Sly, who had been quietly twirling a dagger in his hand, stood and placed a firm hand on the big man's shoulder. "Easy there, big guy. You're not the one calling the shots here. It's the Moon Warrior," Sly said softly, though his voice carried a sharp note of mockery. Dagnar exhaled heavily, his nostrils flaring as he glared at Richard. It was clear he was holding himself back, but he didn't argue further. Richard glanced around the room, his curiosity piqued. Can someone explain to me what this title, Moon Warrior, actually means? Eldar offered a faint smile, as if expecting the question, and began his explanation. The Moon Warrior is a sacred title of our order. It's bestowed upon the strongest knight, someone who has proven their strength, honor, and resolve. Throughout the order's history, there have been few. The last to bear the title was Balthazar, whom we all revered as a symbol of power and justice. If the lady has granted you this title, it means she sees something in you far greater than mere strength. To us, you are a leader, and our duty is to follow you without question. A chill ran down Richard's spine as the weight of the title settled over him. He remembered how Balthazar had been respected, not only within the order but far beyond its borders, and now that mantle had fallen to him, something he hadn't even known until now. I see, he said finally, nodding. In that case, I think waiting for tomorrow is the right call. The trial will give us a chance to pinpoint where the lady and Balthazar are being held. But what about the Order of Darkness? What are they up to? Do we have any intel? Eldar sighed, his expression darkening. Reports are coming in from all over the kingdom, young women disappearing without a trace. But we don't know why. We're combing through the archives, trying to find answers. The Order of Darkness has always been shrouded in secrecy, but the lady or the matriarch may know more. Unfortunately, one is imprisoned, and the other may be dead. His words were cut short by a sharp, derisive cough. From the shadows of the room emerged a frail figure, an old woman whose skin was thin and parchment-like, her eyes deep and dark, brimming with secrets. Her hunched frame appeared delicate, burdened by the weight of countless years. But Richard knew better. Age was a deceiver. She was the matriarch, the eldest among the living, known to all. At her appearance, even Eldar bowed his head in reverence. Richard, too, feeling the weight of her presence, inclined his head respectfully. His mind flashed back to the moment she had handed him the armor he now wore, a moment that had marked him, even if he hadn't realized it then. Eldar quickly stepped toward the matriarch, dropping to one knee with a reverence that was evident in every movement. "Matriarch, you're alive! But how? Why wasn't I informed?" His voice trembled with a mixture of astonishment and relief. The old woman merely smirked, peering at him from beneath her wrinkled lids. "Boy, why should I be dead?" Her voice was sharp, carrying a steely confidence. "I arrived just now and told no one. Don't presume you know everything about me." Her gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Richard. Slowly, she made her way toward a chair, which one of the knights hastily slid forward for her. She sat with a regal poise that seemed utterly at odds with her advanced age. "I see you've managed," she said, addressing Richard, who stood in his human form. Her voice was restrained, but held a note of respect. "You've achieved some of your goals, though I'm not surprised. I saw your potential, but don't grow complacent. Hard times are coming, for you and for this kingdom." Everyone at the table listened intently, hanging on her every word. She continued, her tone slow and deliberate, as if weighing each syllable. "The destruction of our main temple and the betrayal within the Order of Light distracted us from the real threat. We let our guard down, and the enemy has been working in the shadows. They're preparing the next stage of Sha'arak's return." A heavy silence fell over the room, as if her words had drained the very air from it. But the matriarch, as always, shattered the quiet with her voice. "You don't understand what ritual they're preparing because it's only been used once, over 1,000 years ago. It's the ritual of eternal night." Her words sent a ripple of frightened whispers through the room. The tension was palpable as knights exchanged uneasy glances. Some had turned pale as ghosts. Richard frowned, watching the growing unease spread among the group. "Silence!" the matriarch barked, striking the floor with her cane. The sharp sound echoed, cutting through the murmurs. Yes, it's true. We won't be able to stop the ritual across the entire kingdom. It's already in motion. All we can do now is prevent it here, in the capital. She paused, her eyes glinting in the dim torchlight. And that foolish girl, she continued, referring to the lady, allowed herself to be captured. But don't underestimate her. If we lose her, we lose much of our strength. We'll save her, a voice shouted from the far end of the table, quickly echoed by others. I have no doubt, the matriarch replied, her tone softening into something far more dangerous. Tomorrow will bring a terrible battle. Spare no one. By aligning themselves with the darkness, they've become enemies not just of mankind, but of all living things. Tomorrow, you must show them what you're capable of. She took a deep breath, her gaze sharpening, and then added with an icy smile, the ceremony will begin near midday. That's when we strike. I'll be joining the fight myself. Frankly, they've managed to irritate me quite a bit. A dry cough racked her frail body for a moment, her face briefly twisting in effort. But she quickly regained composure, her smile turning sinister. Richard, who had been silently listening, exchanged glances with Finn and Lance. Finn looked tense, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as though running through a dozen scenarios for the next day. Lance, on the other hand, wore a crooked grin, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, as if he'd been invited to a grand feast rather than a deadly battle. It was clear he was eager for the chaos to begin. The city seethed like a boiling cauldron. Crowds flowed toward the main square, where the Temple of Light stood, a towering symbol of the kingdom's strength and justice. But today, the gathering was not for prayers. For the first time in history, a priestess of the Order of the Moonlit Night was to be tried for treason. The event, both shocking and terrifying, had drawn everyone, from humble peasants to affluent townsfolk. People walked with anxious faces, whispering among themselves, hoping the king would appear to quell their fears. Rumors of strange occurrences in the south had spread like mold, leaving everyone unsure of what to believe. Richard moved among the churning crowd, his face hidden beneath a deep hood. His long, dark cloak concealed his armor, allowing him to blend seamlessly into the human river. Nearby, a few steps apart, walked Lance and Finn, similarly cloaked. Even under their disguises, their poise and readiness for combat were unmistakable. Richard squinted, surveying the throng. The time was nearing noon. Soon, everything would begin. As they approached the square, the flow of people slowed, and Richard found himself hemmed in by the press of bodies. The vast space, surrounded by high-roofed houses, was packed, though no one could move beyond the line of guards holding the crowd at bay. The soldiers stood ready, keeping the people at a safe distance from the square's center. Richard's gaze was immediately drawn to something new and unsettling. In the middle of the square stood a massive obelisk, black, with a smooth, mirror-like surface etched with incomprehensible runes. It loomed large, as though it had sprung from the earth overnight. The crowd buzzed with speculation. Where had it come from? How had it been brought here unnoticed? And, most importantly, what was its purpose? Surrounding the obelisk were 12 massive stones. Their surfaces, too, were inscribed with symbols, but they appeared ancient, as if unearthed after centuries of slumber. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as squads of warriors and mages began to assemble at the square. They formed ranks around the obelisk, encircling it tightly. Some of their faces betrayed uncertainty. Many seemed confused, their eyes darting about like those of people who didn't fully grasp why they were there. Richard realized these soldiers hadn't wholly succumbed to darkness. They were likely following orders, unaware of the larger scheme. A heaviness settled in Richard's chest. He didn't want to kill those who might not even understand whom they served. But today, he would likely have no choice. It would be either them or the enemy. The crowd's murmurs swelled into a roar as the king appeared. He was surrounded by a retinue of knights, mages, and nobles, all clad in their finest armor. The king moved with a calm, deliberate grace, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Squinting, he studied the man more closely. The king's eyes were devoid of life, a hollow, vacant stare, like a puppet under someone else's control. Around him, the mages and warriors stood like shadows, ready to act at a moment's notice. Behind the king, Richard spotted two figures that made his hands clench into fists. Master Irwin, the man whose cunning and cruelty had left unhealed scars in Richard's soul. And beside him stood Sir Goodwin, a loyal hound to his master, though his eyes darted about nervously, scanning for threats. He seemed to sense the storm brewing. Richard gritted his teeth, fighting back the surge of anger. His heart hammered in his chest as he muttered under his breath, "I'll get to you both." A voice sounded in his mind, curious and calm. "Something wrong? See someone familiar?" It was Elric, his magical sword, currently disguised as a dagger hanging at his side. Richard nodded, glancing down at the weapon. "Yes, some old acquaintances I've been eager to meet again," he replied bitterly. "Interesting. Perhaps you'll share your past with me someday?" "I doubt you'd find it entertaining." "You're too modest, Richard. But fine, we'll revisit that later. By the way, have you noticed the ones on the rooftops?" The blade's voice shifted, taking on a serious tone. Richard lifted his gaze. On the rooftops surrounding the square, archers and mages had taken up positions. Their bows were drawn, and their hands glowed with magical energy. It was an additional layer of defense, and Richard understood that breaking through would be a monumental task. His own safety was the least of his concerns. He cast a glance toward Lance and Finn. He worried for them. Finn looked focused, his gaze cold and his lips pressed into a thin line. Lance, on the other hand, wore a sly grin, as though someone had just shared a particularly amusing joke. His eyes glinted with excitement, as if he were looking forward to a game rather than a battle. Richard couldn't help but marvel at how different they were. Yet, in this moment, they were united, ready to die for the same cause. The king stepped onto the dais, majestic and composed, but Richard immediately sensed something was wrong. His movements were too measured, his expression too stiff, like a mask molded onto his face. When he spoke, his voice, amplified by magic, rang out across the square, echoing off the stone walls. "Greetings, my loyal subjects. Today, I have called you here for a grave purpose. It pains me deeply to announce that a great betrayal has occurred within our kingdom. Those who have served my family and our ancestors for centuries have raised their arms against me. They sought to overthrow our rule, our sacred religion that warms us with its light, and to jeopardize the very crown itself for their selfish ends." The crowd fell silent, his words cascading like venomous seeds, sowing fear and anger among the people. "As you know," the king continued, "I am a man of great mercy, but such treachery cannot go unpunished, not by me, nor by my people. Thus I have condemned 3 traitors to death. Bring them forth." From the direction of the Temple of Light, a procession emerged, pushing through the throng. At its head marched knights, leading 3 figures bound in magical chains, Lucia, Balthazar, and a man Richard didn't recognize. The crowd erupted in whispers. "That's Prince Larkus," someone nearby gasped. "The king's own brother." Richard's brow furrowed as he studied the prince, questions ricocheting through his mind. How was Larkus connected to Lucia? Why was he here? But his thoughts were interrupted by the sight of 9 more figures trailing behind them. Young women draped in ceremonial robes were being led like sacrificial lambs, their faces pale and fearful. Richard's stomach tightened as realization dawned. They're going to perform the ritual, right here, in front of everyone, he muttered to himself, his fists clenching. The king's voice continued, growing more insidious with every word. "Even my own brother," he declared, gesturing toward Larkis, "has betrayed me. It is a bitter truth, but for the good of the kingdom I cannot forgive such treason." The procession reached the obelisk. The knights began binding Lucia, Balthazar, Larkis, and the young women to the ancient stones surrounding the monolith. Lucia was placed at the center, her striking beauty drawing murmurs from the crowd. Many speculated in hushed tones about her identity, but their attention kept returning to the other victims, trying to guess the purpose of the eerie stones and the ominous obelisk. The shadow of the obelisk crept steadily across the ground, nearing the central stone. The king watched with cold detachment. Then abruptly he laughed, a dry, unnatural sound as if someone had forced it out of him. The crowd stirred uneasily, the murmurs rising to a crescendo. "By executing these traitors, we shall usher in a new era," the king proclaimed, raising his arms toward the heavens. At that moment, figures emerged from the Temple of Light. Cloaked in heavy robes with hoods obscuring their faces, they carried vials filled with thick red liquid. There were 12 of them, and they moved with purpose toward the bound captives. Richard's body tensed. His instincts screamed that this was the moment, the critical point where everything would either fall apart or ignite. He glanced at his companions. Lance wore his trademark smirk, as if anticipating a spectacle, while Finn's eyes darted across the perimeter, sharp and calculating. Richard knew their time was short. Taking a deep breath, he unleashed his power. His body began to shift, muscles surging as his form grew larger. Fabric tore as his transformation pushed against the constraints of his clothing. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and people scattered in panic as Richard revealed his true nature. He loomed over the throng, his presence radiating primal strength. His silver armor, inlaid with glowing blue stones, caught the sunlight, shimmering like a beacon. The hood fell back, and his cloak fluttered to the ground, revealing the Moon Warrior in all his fearsome glory. His wolf-shaped helm gleamed, and his eyes burned with unshakable resolve. With a single, powerful leap, he vaulted over the crowd, landing with a thunderous impact before the guards surrounding the obelisk. The ground quaked beneath him, and for a heartbeat, silence reigned. In his hand, the sword Elric shimmered to life, pulsing with an ethereal glow as if eager for the battle ahead. Richard raised his gaze to the guards, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that cut through the stunned stillness. "Well then, shall we begin?" The sharp ring of steel broke the silence as the first guard unsheathed his blade. Richard roared, letting the druid's magic flood every cell of his body. His muscles tensed, his eyes burned with primal fury, and the sword in his hands seemed to come alive, glowing with a faint green light. He surged forward, the ground trembling under his feet. The guards hesitated for a brief moment, taken aback by his imposing figure, but their shock quickly gave way to shouts as they charged to meet him. The first among them barely had time to raise their weapons before Richard was upon them. A single swing of his blade sent 2 guards flying backward as if struck by a hurricane. A swift kick disarmed another, sending him sprawling to the ground. Richard moved with the speed and precision of a predator, his strikes devastating and unrelenting. One guard lunged at him with a spear, but Richard effortlessly caught the shaft and hurled the man into the crowd, clearing his path forward. He didn't stop. His enchanted armor absorbed the arrows and spells raining down on him like a storm. Some he deflected with his blade, others he dodged entirely, his focus never wavering. Every step brought him closer to the obelisk, the hostages and the cultists advancing with their crimson vials. From the sidelines, Dagnar and Sly watched in awe. "Are you seeing this?" Sly breathed, momentarily forgetting to spin his dagger. "He's cutting through them like they're nothing." "I see it," Dagnar rumbled, his voice low and filled with restrained energy. "But this isn't the end." Their prediction proved accurate. A moment later, 20 soldiers swarmed Richard at once, surrounding him like a pack of wolves. They pressed in, shouting commands to overwhelm him, but Richard didn't falter. Instead, he barreled forward like a battering ram, scattering them like dry leaves in a storm. Bodies collided and fell, clearing a path for him to charge ahead. The cultists were perilously close to the captives now. The obelisk's shadow crept across the ground, nearly touching Lucia. Richard pushed himself harder, but before he could close the distance, the king's voice rang out from the dais. "What are you waiting for? Stop him!" A flood of reinforcements poured into the square. Knights of 3 orders, mages, and archers, forming a dense ring around Richard. Their weapons gleamed, their shields interlocked, cutting off any escape. Richard came to a halt, scanning the encirclement. His eyes blazed, his breathing steady and controlled. The soldiers stared back, some with fear, others with overconfidence, convinced that their numbers would be enough to subdue him. "It's time for my idea," Elric's voice murmured in Richard's mind, and he drove the blade into the ground. Richard began channeling the druid's energy, his body enveloped in an intensifying glow. The earth beneath him trembled, and the soldiers hesitated, unsure of what he was doing. Their hesitation didn't last long. They rushed him in unison. As they closed in, Richard unleashed the energy. A blinding burst of light erupted from the sword, illuminating the entire square. The magical shockwave surged outward, knocking hundreds of enemies off their feet. Some were thrown into unconsciousness, others lay wounded, and the once impenetrable ring of soldiers dissolved into chaos. The ground split open, and from the cracks emerged massive roots and vines, snaking through the square. They coiled around knights and mages, pinning them to the earth, rendering them helpless. This was the work of Richard's allies. On the rooftops, archers and mages turned toward a shadowy figure wielding a spear shrouded in darkness. Lance moved like a specter, swift and silent, his strikes lethal. Bodies began to fall from the rooftops, crumpling like autumn leaves. Below, amidst the chaos, Ely darted through the enemy ranks. His small frame moved with eerie agility, his dagger flashing as he dispatched foes with surgical precision. Nearby, Dagnar, a living battering ram, smashed through enemy lines, sending men flying with each swing of his massive arms. At the edge of the fray, Garvis stood, his face glistening with sweat as he chanted an incantation. A sudden surge of lunar magic radiated from his hands, dropping scores of guards where they stood. Meanwhile, Eldar and his knights cast off their cloaks, roaring as they charged into the fray, their swords carving a path through the enemy ranks. The square had descended into a full-scale battle. The king, still standing on the dais, surveyed the carnage with a growing sense of dread. His eyes darted from one skirmish to the next, watching as his army began to falter. The crowd of townsfolk, frozen in place, could only watch in stunned silence, unsure who the heroes were and who the villains might be. Richard took advantage of the chaos, darting toward the hostages. His muscles tensed, and he leaped high into the air, seemingly hanging there for a heartbeat. When he crashed back down, his sword flashed in a deadly arc, cutting through the cultists like a storm tearing through dry leaves. He spared no one. Each swing of his blade was a sentence of death. Blood splattered the stone tiles, and the cultists, desperately trying to hold their ground, fell one by one. As he cut down the last of his enemies, Richard turned toward Balthazar. With a single, mighty swing, he shattered the chains binding the old man. Balthazar collapsed to his knees, rubbing his numb hands. Even in this moment, his voice carried a gruff disapproval. "Did you have to be in such a hurry, boy? Now I'll have to fight." Richard smirked, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good to see you, old man." Balthazar tilted his head upward, his blind eyes seemingly fixing on Richard, and let out a dry chuckle. "What took you so long?" Without wasting another second, Richard strode toward Lucia. Meanwhile, Balthazar, retrieving a sword that lay nearby, rose to his feet. Despite his age, he threw himself into the fray with surprising ferocity. His strikes were powerful and precise, scattering enemies like ragdolls. With such a companion at his back, Richard could fight without worrying about his rear. He reached Lucia, and with a single stroke, severed her bonds. She landed lightly on the ground, rubbing her wrists, her face breaking into a warm smile. "I've been waiting for you," she said softly. Richard nodded, but kept his eyes on the battlefield. He spotted familiar figures, Master Irvin and Sir Goodwin. A fire of rage ignited within him, and he turned sharply toward Balthazar. "Free the others, old man," he barked over his shoulder. Lucia moved toward the king, but her path was blocked by Archmagister Armand, the head of the Tower of Mages. Their gazes locked, and within seconds a fierce duel erupted. Spells clashed mid-air, lighting up the square with bursts of energy. Richard, meanwhile, approached his targets with deliberate steps. He stopped a few paces away, glaring at them with contempt. "Long time no see," he said coldly. Sir Goodwin stepped forward, his sword trembling in his hands, but he managed to raise it. Master Irvin scowled, trying to maintain his composure. "Who are you?" Irvin demanded. Richard's lips curled into a cruel smile, his voice dropping to a growl. "Don't you remember? You threw me off a cliff." Their expressions shifted instantly. Irvin's face turned ashen, while Goodwin looked like he'd seen a ghost. "You... Richard?" Goodwin whispered, taking a step back. Richard nodded, his eyes blazing with fury. "It's time to settle the score." He surged forward with blinding speed, giving them no time to react. His sword plunged through Goodwin's chest. The knight, blood pouring from his wound, looked down at the blade before raising his eyes to Richard. His face was frozen in terror. "How?" he murmured, just as the light in his eyes flickered and died. Richard wrenched his sword free, casting a final glance at his fallen foe before turning to Irvin. The master stood frozen, stunned. Richard charged at him, sword raised, but a sudden flare of fire deflected the strike. Irvin was thrown back, landing on his feet with surprising agility. His eyes burned with a mix of fear and resolve. "Who are you?" he shouted. Richard didn't answer, attacking again. Irvin dodged and countered, sending streams of flame at Richard. It became clear why he had risen to lead the order. The man was formidable. Their duel was fierce, each clash of steel and magic lighting up the battleground. Suddenly, Richard felt a chilling presence, cold enough to seep into his very bones. His instincts screamed danger. He turned to see a towering figure approaching. It was a skeletal knight, its empty eye sockets glowing with an icy blue light. In its hand, it wielded an enormous frost-covered blade. Despite its undead form, it moved with eerie speed, radiating such immense magical power that even Richard felt its crushing weight. Tensing, Richard braced himself for what he knew would be one of the toughest battles he had ever faced. Richard drew upon every ounce of power within him, letting the druidic magic course through his veins and saturate every fiber of his being. The air around him churned, a whirlwind forming at his feet, making him look like a force of nature incarnate. With a guttural roar, he charged straight at the skeletal knight. Their clash was thunderous. A shockwave of raw energy rippled out, scattering nearby enemies and sending shards of stone and broken weapons flying. The skeletal knight was thrown from his spectral steed, tumbling through the air, only to land effortlessly on his feet. His hollow eye sockets flared with a brighter, more menacing glow, and a low, gravelly voice rumbled forth. "You've grown stronger," the knight said. In Richard's mind, the voice of Elric, his spectral mentor, chimed in with an almost mischievous tone. "This one's no pushover, but he's the perfect test for your new powers. Go on, show him what you've got." Richard quickly scanned the battlefield. Master Irvin was gone, and a curse escaped his lips. But there was no time to search. The skeletal knight was advancing, his massive frost-covered sword leaving a trail of rime on the cobblestones. Turning his fury toward the undead foe, Richard launched himself into the fray. Their swords collided with an ear-splitting clang, sending vibrations through the air. Each strike was lethal, each parry a matter of survival. Despite his massive armor, the skeletal knight moved with an agility that defied his form, yet Richard was faster, dodging strikes and delivering counters that forced the knight to backpedal. The fight was grueling. Every swing of Richard's blade grew more precise, more forceful, pushing the knight closer to defeat. The cracks in his defenses were becoming evident. Sensing his disadvantage, the skeletal knight stepped back, gripped his own chest, and tore through his breastplate with a savage pull. A sickly, deathly light enveloped him as he reached into his ribcage and pulled forth a dark, obsidian-like heart. Holding it aloft, he spoke with a chilling finality. "You are a worthy opponent. I wager my life on this battle." With that, he crushed the heart in his bony hand. A blinding flash of light erupted, forcing Richard to shield his eyes. When his vision cleared, the knight had transformed. His armor now gleamed like polished silver, exuding an aura of deathly cold. The frost blade in his hand shimmered as though it contained the fury of a winter storm. He charged at Richard with terrifying speed, his first strike sending the warrior skidding backward. Richard's boots carved deep grooves into the stone as he struggled to maintain his footing. "He's stronger now," Elric's voice warned, a rare note of concern creeping into his tone. "Focus, Richard. Don't let your guard down." Richard steadied himself and lunged forward, meeting the knight head-on. Their blows were relentless, the clash of frost and druidic magic lighting up the battlefield. Each strike unleashed waves of energy, shaking the ground and sending echoes through the air. Richard's fiery energy countered the icy blasts from the knight's blade, the two forces locked in a deadly dance. But it wasn't enough. Richard realized that brute force alone wouldn't win this fight. He needed something more. His trump card. He leapt back, distancing himself from the knight, and raised his sword high. Closing his eyes, he called upon the full might of the druidic magic within him. Energy began to coalesce around his blade, a brilliant light forming at its tip, growing brighter with every passing second. It was as if a star had descended into his hands. The skeletal knight roared, sensing the threat, and charged forward. His frost blade glowed with deadly intent as he swung it with all his might. But he was too late. Richard brought his sword down in a devastating arc. A searing beam of light erupted from the blade, blinding and unstoppable. It tore through the knight's icy aura, striking his sword and sending a cascade of sparks into the air. The knight held his ground, roaring in defiance, but the light was unrelenting. His armor began to crumble, pieces flaking away into nothingness. His bones, once impervious, turned to dust under the pressure. In his final moments, the knight let out a guttural growl, his resistance fading as the light consumed him. Then, with a final burst of radiance, he was gone. Where he had once stood, only a small pile of ash remained, scattered by the wind moments later. Richard stood amidst the destruction, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. His arms trembled from the strain, and he wiped a hand across his brow. Memories of their last encounter flooded his mind, the time when this very knight had effortlessly severed his limbs, leaving him for dead. "Have I really grown this strong?" he whispered to himself, staring at the empty space where his enemy had fallen. Richard sensed something was wrong the moment the air grew oppressively heavy, as if weighed down by lead. His gaze darted across the square until it landed on a cloaked figure near the obelisk. The stranger had just placed a blood-red gem into a socket at its base, and it began to glow with an ominous light. What is he doing? Richard's mind raced, but the answer came too quickly. The king, his face twisted with unhinged fervor, suddenly bolted toward the altar. In his hand was a small vial of crimson liquid, glinting in the eerie light. His eyes burned with maniacal devotion as he screamed incomprehensible words, his voice lost in the chaos. "No!" Richard shouted, sprinting after him, but it was too late. The king lifted the vial and without hesitation downed its contents in one swift motion. Almost immediately, his body convulsed, and crimson lines began to writhe across his skin like veins bursting to the surface. Richard froze mid-step, dread clawing at his gut. The crimson plague, he realized. This forbidden magic consumed life itself, turning it into raw energy for dark rituals. The king let out a blood-curdling scream amplified by magic that echoed across the city. The entire square fell silent. Warriors, cultists, and civilians alike stopped in their tracks, entranced by the horrifying spectacle. The king's body radiated a blood-red light as streams of energy poured from him into the obelisk, enveloping the monolith in a pulsating glow. His scream grew shriller, more desperate, until it was unbearable. People covered their ears, but the sound seemed to pierce their very souls. The king's face shriveled, his body withering like an old tree drained of sap. Moments later, he collapsed into a dried husk, a mere shell of the once great ruler who had trusted the wrong hands. Richard stood frozen, watching as the obelisk erupted with a brilliant crimson beam, slicing through the sky and staining the clouds a deep, ominous red. A moment later, the beam seemed to call forth a dense, malevolent fog that began to spread, smothering the sky. Richard's eyes narrowed as he spotted another beam far in the distance. This isn't the only obelisk, he realized, his chest tightening with fear. The crimson mist continued to spread, its tendrils painting the ground in eerie shades of red before darkening to a deep maroon, and finally, an almost impenetrable black. The once clear sky had turned into a suffocating void. Darkness swallowed the land. Panic rippled through the square as people screamed in terror, scattering in every direction. The battle was over, but no one felt victorious. Archmagister Armand, who had been locked in combat with Lucia, stepped back, raising a hand. "It's done. We're leaving," he announced coolly, retreating toward a portal that materialized behind him. He barked orders to his followers, who began flocking to the portal. Among them, Richard spotted Master Irvin, emerging from the shadows with a hateful glare. Their eyes met briefly before Irvin slipped into the portal. Richard surged forward, but Lucia stopped him with a firm gesture. Armand was shielding their retreat with powerful spells, deflecting any attempt to stop them. As the last of the traitors vanished, the Archmagister turned, a sinister smile curling on his lips. "You've lost. Darkness now reigns over the world." But just as he prepared to step into the portal, a dry, rasping voice cut through the gloom. "Leaving so soon? Without a parting gift?" From the shadows emerged the matriarch, her weathered face glowing faintly with an unnatural light. In her hands was a sphere of concentrated energy, shimmering with an intensity that seemed to defy the encroaching darkness. Without hesitation, she hurled it at Armand. The Archmagister raised a hand to deflect the attack, but instead of dissipating, the sphere absorbed his counterspell and barreled forward. It struck his arm and began consuming him, spreading rapidly as if feeding on his essence. Armand's scream tore through the square as he staggered back, his flesh and magic alike being devoured. "You damned hag! This isn't over!" he roared before stumbling into the portal, his agonized cries echoing long after he disappeared. The matriarch turned to the gathered crowd, her piercing gaze fixed on the blackened sky. Her voice was steady, though it carried the weight of inevitability. "A new era begins today. Whether we survive it or not depends entirely on us." A cold fear gripped Richard's heart as he looked up at the sky, now shrouded in a sinister, blood-black mist. It was hard to fathom that the sun, once so bright and warm, had been completely obscured by this malevolent veil. The fear was real, but Richard reminded himself of the stories of heroes who had faced similar challenges. Now it was their turn. The square gradually filled with the sounds of reality returning. The warriors still standing began to lower their weapons. Some surrendered, while others stood motionless, stunned by what had transpired. Among them, Richard spotted Prince Larkus, walking toward them with a mixture of exhaustion and determination etched on his face. Lucia turned to the prince, her voice calm yet laced with authority. "You're king now. A great responsibility rests on your shoulders." Prince Larkus lowered his gaze for a moment, absorbing her words. They struck deep. but he stood silently, listening. "Your first act must be to issue the last day's call," she continued. "As decreed by our ancestors, every hero of this kingdom must rally to help the people reach the strongholds. After that, you must mobilize the economy, the scholars, and the mages. Everything must be done to secure our survival." Larkus nodded, his voice firm despite the despair lingering beneath it. "It will be done." Lucia then turned to her knights, her tone softening but remaining resolute. "You fought bravely today, but now the people need you. Help them survive, guide them to safety, protect them until they reach the strongholds." The knights of the Moonlit Order knelt, their heads bowed in solemn acknowledgement. "It will be done, my lady," they responded in unison. With that, Lucia turned to Richard. Her gaze was sharp, almost unnervingly perceptive. "And what about you?" she asked. Richard paused, his thoughts briefly wandering before glancing at Lance, who stood at his side. His friend's usual grin was present, but there was an unmistakable spark of expectation in his eyes. "I promised my friend I'd help him find his family," Richard said, his voice resolute. Lucia nodded, her expression a mix of approval and caution. "Good, but stay vigilant. You've caught the enemy's attention, and now they'll hunt you. They won't let you rest." Richard gave a curt nod, but before he could respond, Balthazar's gravelly voice cut in. "This time I'm going with you." Richard turned, surprised. "What about Agna?" he asked. Lucia stepped forward, her expression softening. "She'll stay with me. I'll train her and make her my successor. She needs to grow strong." The words hit Richard like a blow. He didn't want to part with Agna again, but he knew Lucia was right. This was the best way to prepare her for the harsh world they now faced. He exchanged glances with his companions. Their faces mirrored the same tension he felt, but they all knew there was no time to hesitate. Richard looked at the blackened sky once more. This was the beginning of a new, dangerous chapter. Unseen challenges loomed ahead, but he was ready to face them head-on. What awaits us now, he wondered, gripping the hilt of his sword tightly.